Hey, Black Women Be Well family. It's your host, Jennifer Tomlinson, and today's episode is a little bit different. We are obviously not in the studio because we are dealing with the coronavirus lockdown. So, what you are going to listen to or watch, if you're watching on YouTube, is a video conference between myself and our guest, Dr. Heather Bryson. And the title for today's episode is Sister in Solidarity. If you're quick, you'll notice that the letters spell out sis. So, sis, Sister in Solidarity. And it's really just a conversation between a Black woman, myself, and a white woman, Dr. Heather Bryson. We talk about a lot of things. We start off talking about the history of Black and white women working together for voting rights, but we really end up having just an authentic and vulnerable conversation between what Black women need from white women and the work that white women can do to be an ally or an advocate. So you need to listen to this if you are a Black woman that, like myself, struggle with working with white women in different spaces. I think you'll learn a lot. I share my own experiences, and this is really, though, very important for white women to hear this episode. If you want to do authentic work, if you want to be an ally or an advocate, I think our conversation might enlighten you, help you, give you some things to think about. So listen, learn, and be well. Hello, Dr. Bryson.
Hey.
Welcome to the Black Women Be Well podcast. I'm so glad you got to join us today, considering, that we're in lockdown.
Right. Well, thank you so much for having me.
And to our listeners, viewers, some might not know, but Dr. Bryson and I are actually work colleagues. We are both professors at the same institution, and we recently collaborated on a special project called hashtag Votes for All. We were actually asked by Rachel Allen, the director of the Peace and Justice Institute, to work together on this project. And Dr. Bryson served as the historian, really, like the expert. And
We all work together.
we did, but you brought your wealth of knowledge. And you were, what was the official title, like the project manager or
Yeah, I guess.
coordinator?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something like that.
And so we, like you said, we worked together to create these sessions where we created events in the community and at Valencia College to talk about, really the major point was to drive home the importance of voting. And we drove that message hard by talking about the history of the women's suffrage movement, because this is a voting year and it is the centennial of the women's suffrage movement. And we just like doing hard stuff, I guess, because we also wanted to talk about race and gender as it pertains to Black women.
Right.
Um, and so, can you start us off and tell us a little bit about? So you created the presentation, as you would say, the lecture part to teach the people in the room the history. Could you share with our listeners some of that history of what we talked about, this and the significant stuff we talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. And from here on out, please, Heather rather than Dr.
Dr.
Bryson.
Price. Okay, yeah. All right, I got you, Heather.
um, so what I mean, in my view, and I think that this was such a collective effort, as you know, I made that presentation 3 or 4 times and gathered feedback and tweaked it. Um, But from my view, what we're trying to do is really tell the history of women's suffrage um, from, including Black women in that movement because they belong there. They were part of that history. But so often when we talk about women's rights, we're really talking about white women's rights. and we're telling the story of how white women fought for their own rights. And so, one of the aspects of this project is to incorporate Black women into the story and to put them where they belong in the history of the fight for suffrage. As well, I think we're also trying to connect, and it's, the current term is fragility, but sort of the fragility of white manhood at the turn of the century, um, because they're fighting against women's suffrage, but they're also fighting against this rising power of the Black community. And by rising power, I mean economic power, political power.
Mm-hmm.
We in 1920 are at the close of World War One, um, and so we're linking women's suffrage to also the local lynching of July Perry, which took place in Ocoee, Florida,
Mm-hmm.
and the racial massacre that took place in that town on Election Day,
Right.
1920. So we're trying to put these two strains together, and they belong together. It's just hard to see the connections. We're trying to put the the fight for women's suffrage and all of the biracial or multiracial aspects of that alongside this racial massacre that takes place on election day.
Yeah.
And so that's been the complex aspect of the work, in my opinion. I mean, do you think that they belong together, these two narratives?
Absolutely. And I think that us taking on the project of trying to talk about the place of Black women was a daunting task because people usually don't. We get lumped either into the racial history or the gender history. And so um, you have to talk about it both. You have to talk about the two things that were going on to tell our story because we have footing in each side. And it's very complex, it's very strained, and it's not easy history because Black women historically have been either marginalized by the women's movement or the abolitionist movement, and so we it's also hard because we've been traumatized a little bit, so it's a difficult conversation to also navigate. But they are relevant because we had to talk about it in order to tell our story because our stories are in both, so
Is
they're
there?
completely relevant. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something that I learned along my research with this, which is, what we call intersectionality.
Mm-hmm.
That Black women are talking about that in the 19th century all the way through. And I should have assumed that, but I didn't. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
these really astute observations about um, oppression, both for gender and for race. So I've really enjoyed the research that
Yeah.
was involved. Yeah.
And I know you and I have talked off camera while we were prepping for this, and I wanted to tell you and introduce the concept of um, a concept of my show. This idea of it being a sister or a sister in solidarity, and what that means really is are there racial allies that want to do hard work like you are, that want to help with the process authentically, um, and just have those tough conversations and do the tough work. And so for you and I working together, I plucked you out of. I know I told you this, like I really feel a connection between us.
I do too. I do too.
Because there's not a lot of this type of bonding between Black and white women doing the work together because there is that trauma and restoration that still needs to happen. But I did want to just tell you at least that you being the first white woman on guest on the show, that you are a sister in solidarity, and
Thank
I
you.
appreciate you. Yeah, and through your knowledge, you're teaching, but you're also learning through the process, and hopefully having us show you the perspective, our perspective has just enriched your research even more. um,
Oh, it really has. And through the work with this project as well as the Truth and Justice project, I think I've learned more just through conversations and interactions and the feedback that we're getting from these events than I have through so much of my academic research.
Mm-hmm.
And what's so nice, in my opinion, about these interactions as we're planning these events, and then my work with the Truth and Justice Project, which became the Alliance for Truth and Justice, is just the honesty. I think that
Yeah.
it's really hard to trust um, across racial lines
Mm-hmm.
for different reasons. And I feel as though Rachel and you and I have been able to establish that, and that's extended to the group of women that we're working with for these events.
Yeah, and let me describe the event for those that are listening. So what we ended up creating was a 20 or 30-minute presentation, or history story, really, that Heather goes through in the beginning of the event. And then Rachel Allen and I really were thoughtful about how to facilitate conversation after. So it's not a come sit, watch, and leave. And I that really made me feel better type of thing. It's we realized that the conversations would be difficult and the history is hard and could be re-traumatizing. And we really wanted to drive this concept of solidarity and coming together and learning from each other. So after Heather's lecture, we created small groups within the spaces, and did an exercise called serial testimony, where we learn from each other through stories, sharing our stories. And then we also had expert panelists come in and bring in like the academic side of it and the expertise. And a lot of times the spaces were vastly different. We had student spaces, we had affluent spaces, depending on which part of the community we were engaged with. Um, and so, like you said, there was real power, I think, in the exchange piece of us being authentic and honest and sharing our stories with each other, because I feel like that's where the real paradigm shift comes, when we're authentic and vulnerable enough to share with each other, to learn from each other.
I think so too. And from the white perspective, which is of course my perspective, I think that you and Rachel have been able to create a space where white women feel okay to admit some truths.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's rare because it's hard, and I'm not quite sure why it's so hard, because those of us who are in the room are really working for racial justice, but it's difficult to talk about race.
Yeah.
It just is. And so I've just been so proud of the work that you guys have done, because people are talking about it. They're telling hard stories to
Mm-hmm.
complete strangers about
Yeah.
one of the more difficult topics.
I think that um, I know from the Black experience, or being a Black woman, it's extremely difficult for me to be vulnerable enough to share a story with and I'll be honest, because this is, a show of honesty, to affluent white women. And the fear is always that I'll share this story and it'll be taken like a tool. And that's the work. I hate being in those type of uncertain spaces where people are like, wow, thank you for sharing your story, I'm going to use it now.
And
And
what do
there's
you
that,
mean? And like, use it like how?
like, I'm going to use your story to help me do better work, and I'm going to tell your story to other people. And it's like, that's not, I'm not a tool. My story isn't a tool. I'm more than happy to share my story for you to have an internal shift, and that you can share back in a way that I can also use your story as a window for me. But I am not in the business of sharing my story so you can collect and use. So that's the fear on my end as a Black woman. What I see from white women, I always see this sense of fear coming from a place of just not wanting, and I understand it, like just not wanting to be, not to say the wrong thing or be labeled a racist if you are really honest and say what's actually a thought of yours or a feeling. And because your vulnerability could be absolutely met with hostility or immediate judgment.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the way that I feel. Nervous
Yeah.
about saying the wrong thing, or just showing a side of my perspective that isn't right.
Mm-hmm.
Um and and I think those two experiences, you being fearful of being used, and then from the white perspective being fearful of being judged or condemned, I think those are two really interesting perspectives, because I think we're acknowledging that the history of whites should be judged, and the history of African Americans has been one of, exploitation. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting that it comes on such a personal level. We
Wow,
carry these histories with us.
that is such a good point that you made. Wow, that I can trace my own insecurity obviously throughout
Right.
history, and then you can do the same. Um, and I don't know that there's enough spaces there where people can honestly just say what they're thinking, and for you not to be immediately judged by me, or and vice versa, not be immediately
Right.
exploited. There's not enough safe spaces, and I think that's the the boundary we're facing now, is that we don't have enough spaces to really share, and for those things to not immediately happen.
Yeah, I would agree. And we're talking about people who are invested in this. I mean, which is, from my perspective, a small amount of people in this country. And so, even with those who are invested in racial restoration and trying to create a better future racially for this country and for one another, we're still hitting these boundaries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I was to say, and this is another boundary, and really what can create healing in that restoration we talk about, for me to say, this is the ways in which I've been exploited, and here's how I need to be restored, requires someone to say, I admit I did those things, and forgive me for, and here's what I'll do. Um, but no one is saying it. I'm not sharing, and no one's, and in the fear of not, actually of being exploited, and then also no one is saying oh, I admit that I admit that historically we have done this, and here's what we can do to create equity and to restore. And so
But what's
this
interesting, oh, sorry, keep going,
No, no,
honey.
no. I just wanted to say the sad thing is what we're talking about, the power that women have in democracy and working together. Black and white women could be powerful, but we can't come together because those things are still existing. But
I know,
mhm.
I know. And that's exactly, um, I thought a lot about that because of the email that you sent that had sort of this outline of how white women and black women, or why they should come together right now. And there are so many reasons for that. But as you say, it's a very fraught space.
Mhm.
And what's also interesting about what you just said, is that the onus is really on white women. I mean, what do black women have to do to change the racial dynamic? I don't even know. I mean, white women need to change the racial dynamic because
Yeah,
we are the ones who are perpetuating injustice.
absolutely.
And so, you know, I,
Well,
you know,
I mean, we don't. You don't have the answer. I don't have the answer.
No, but I should
um,
say, because you just, I should say I'm sorry for the ways in which I've taken part in any kind of racial injustice throughout my life, because you're sitting here in front of me saying, white women need to acknowledge and apologize. And so let me, because there have been times where I've heard a racial slur or a statement, um, especially in high school and college. And sometimes I would address it, and sometimes I wouldn't. Sometimes I would just, you know, not be friends with that person, but not engage them and fight for the African American community.
Mm.
And so I'm sorry.
Thank you, Heather. And and that's what you didn't even have to say that because sitting through your lecture, I know that you already internalized that, but it does feel good to hear it. And I can only hope that those that watch this can see the courage that it does take to do something like that, and that there are some instances where you're not immediately met with. Um, I mean, you could get met with it, but in this case, you're not met with the, well, that's not good enough, or here's some more things you need to feel sorry for. And it does take courage. It does take courage to say that. And I think that a lot of white women are just not there yet, but you're at a different place to have that moment with me right now, you know.
Well, thank you. But I think, Jennifer, it also takes courage to acknowledge that that's something that you'd like to hear. I mean, we're talking about this, like being vulnerable, um and you've really shown me how to have these conversations. And I remember it was either the first or second time that we met, and you said to Rachel and you said, I just want white women to stand up for us when we're not around.
Mm.
And I thought, I mean, that was just such an incredibly powerful thing to hear, because I feel that way about men. Like,
Mm.
if there's a group of men and somebody says something, that denigrates women, I want a man in that room to address it.
Mm-hmm.
And so to listen to you say that, I mean, after you left the classroom where we were, I just looked at Rachel and I said, I mean, it was just such a good thing to hear.
Can we keep, if you don't mind, having this moment on as we're recorded, because I could share some more, and I feel safe in this space that I'm not always safe, but I do feel safe now. If we can keep
Yeah.
the full conversation going. So some other things that I'm very careful about how I phrase, because I don't want to come off we're always archetyped as aggressive, or we just got too much trauma we can't get over. So I always try to be very careful the way in which I word things, and I think that's another burden Black women um, walk around with, that we can't just say what it is that we want, you know. And so I'm going to be honest and say something. And when people talk about forgiveness or an apology, they do it the best way that they can based on how they grew up, or how they've experienced saying I'm sorry and forgiving. And so I know people are only coming with what they have. My dad always uses this term. He says, consider the context, or consider the source. So whenever I'm hearing something from people, I try to live by that, to not immediately judge or be offended. So I always say, consider the source, because people are going to have a forgiving moment based on what they know how to forgive, or their childhood experiences. So when I really talk about restorative forgiveness, it really isn't just an I'm sorry. For me, it has to come from a sentence of forgive me for. And I'm not telling you you need to do this now. I just wanted to share on air what I think a lot of a lot of people need when they talk about restorative forgiveness. That forgive me for, and for someone to be very specific about what they're asking, because the I'm sorry is really for you. It's a personal feeling of I am. it doesn't really do anything for me. It doesn't allow me to participate in the process. I can just sit and kind of say thank you or say no thank you. But a forgive me for engages in a conversation. It allows me to say yes I do or no I don't. You know, and so I do wish that more um, organizations that have been historically uh, prejudiced against Black women or have marginalized us, I wish that I could hear that. Forgive us for what we've done, specifically XYZ. And that allows me to engage in the process versus not saying anything at all or just saying, we're sorry, you know.
I think that makes, in hearing that, it's it's accurate because I just a couple of minutes ago said I'm sorry, and then you had the instinct to make me feel better.
Yeah.
And like you're exactly right that it is about the person who's saying I am
Yeah.
rather than giving any kind of agency other than sort of sympathy
Mm-hmm.
to the person that they're speaking with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I feel like if a lot more opportunities for white and Black women to have that kind of forgiveness opportunity or type of discussion, albeit hard, that's where the healing comes from. It allows the other person that's asking for forgiveness to really cathartically work through the I'm almost cursed the stuff, and then it allows the person receiving it to really process whether or not they're at a place to take it or not and to participate. But we don't have those types of spaces enough to allow Black and white women to work through those issues in that way to move forward.
Right. I no, we don't have those types of spaces. And I don't think that we even have the education or the knowledge to ask what needs to be forgiven.
Mm-hmm.
So you know that my family took part in the Rosewood massacre.
Mm-hmm.
And and I can't ask for forgiveness for that because I didn't do that. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's a, a terrible shame. And it is something that I feel guilty about, although I think it's misplaced guilt because
Mm-hmm.
I didn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other ways that I've participated in perpetuating racial injustice. And it's not just walking away from a bigot in high school or college. It's not educating myself. And it's taking, I've just learned so much through studying history that
Mm-hmm.
I'm aware to some degree of the structures that are in place that have perpetuated white privilege and African American oppression.
Mm-hmm.
So I I don't even know if white people fully know how much they have to apologize for. and so um and so I think it starts with really an education about how how after Reconstruction, how after World War One, how after World War Two, these moments where racial um, equity or equality really sort of could have happened in this country,
Mm-hmm.
and how white powers went about shutting those doors
Yeah.
over and over and over, and how white people got used to looking the other way.
Yeah. And that's it. So for the internal work someone has to do to even get to a place to ask for forgiveness, it's difficult and could be a long road.
Yes, I think
Yes.
so.
You
But
guys have you guys have tough work.
that's it's so true. It is
Yeah.
so true. But I think it's something that's necessary
Absolutely.
if if we want to get to a place where the space between white women and black women isn't fraught, where we can really free ourselves, um, psychologically, white women can free ourselves to just say, this is every way that I've participated, and please forgive me.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course, that's, you know, that's
I
what
have
I.
something else I want to share with you,
Yeah.
if you don't mind. Um, when we talk about intersectionality,
Mhm.
and for those that are listening, we've talked about that in the our last episode with Rudy Darden. We defined it, but intersectionality is essentially, the different multicultural selves that make up who we are. So, for me, a big intersectionality obviously is my race and gender. There are other things that make up who I am. One of those things are my socioeconomic status or my class. And so that is something I had to learn to really be thoughtful in including in my conversations about myself and who I am. I had some tough work when I went to the a training last summer, and I mean, it was put in my face that I wasn't ready to deal with it, but I dealt with it anyways. That my class as a poor woman, a poor Black woman, has really shaped who I am and how I engage with other people to a great extent. And I don't acknowledge it enough. People don't like talking about their class or their money. It's just something in America we don't do. We don't talk about money. Um, but it actually is so influential into shaping who we are and how we talk to each other and how we treat each other, that it's also subconscious. We don't realize it. And I think that there's a lot of animosity, honestly, or let me not use that word. There's a lot of complexity between poor Black women and rich white women. It's just, we're in different planets, we speak different languages, and that is something I also struggle with is honestly being able to bridge that gap. And that is something that I do struggle with. I don't know how to, and I know it's the work that I'm doing now, but it's something I really do struggle with.
And how, like, what happened in that seed training, or how do you think that class has informed how you think or how you talk to, affluent white
Yeah.
women?
I realize that I am a part of a problem where I do not um, demonstrate or showcase what poverty or poor actually looks like, because I'm so consumed with trying to make people of those spaces know that I belong in those spaces. So I'll come off with like the word, like I have my coined phrases that I know that I need to say, like, oh, I've been to Europe too, or I have a master's degree, or I've read that book too, or I've seen that play, and it helps me let them know like I belong here. I feel valid, and hopefully that people will listen to me, and that I don't feel. I hate that feeling of, like I don't belong here. I just hate that feeling. And it's my attempt subconsciously to assimilate. And I had no idea, because maybe a part of me was ashamed of my own socioeconomic class. I'm trying to move up in a hierarchy to make people feel like I belong, but also to make myself feel like I belong. And so, rich white women have a distorted view of poverty. They think poor is a homeless person on the street. And I'm like, no, I'm literally right next to you. You have no idea that this is what a poor person looks like. And here is my story and my struggles. And so that was the thing that really shocked me, that I'm not talking about my economic class, really has prevented some of those conversations to move forward, and for rich white women to really know the stories and the circumstances of poor Black women.
It's like a, Jennifer, it's like a minefield. I mean, I so the way in which I've experienced something similar is just being in rooms with men.
Mm-hmm.
And and just knowing that if something upsets me, not to show emotion, and we're fighting against these stereotypes and trying to earn access or earn a seat at the table even though we belong there. We just don't, you know, we've had these lives that have told us that we don't really belong there. And that's one. And you have three. Like you're
Yeah.
talking about intersectionality. So there are only some spaces where I feel like there are minds that I need to avoid. Um, and I can't imagine having to navigate, and not only navigate, but you're so conscious of it. You're
Mm-hmm.
aware of the fact that, yeah, dropping in, I've been to Europe, or I read this book, or I have an advanced, I have my master's. It's not only are you doing it, but you're aware that you're doing it. I mean, it's your internal work is so admirable. It's amazing.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, excuse me. I just, and class is another one of those things, and it's such a shame, in my opinion, in this country that people who are born without money or don't have a lot of money, um that they have to fight against these stereotypes when we're living in this extremely capitalist society
Yeah.
where it should be the opposite, when
Right.
people who have an enormous amount of wealth, they should be ashamed of
Yeah.
themselves,
Yeah.
um not those who are.
What I appreciate about me sharing this a while ago, and this is that concept of windows and mirrors of, and this is that type of sharing that I talked about that I really, um, this is the type of exchange that I appreciate. For me to share my story with you, and then you say to me, I acknowledge how your story is different. Here's how I also can understand what you're going through because for white women in affluent male spaces, you kind of have some empathy, like you understand, but you can also step back and realize that what I experience around affluent white men, you also experience around me, and that's the type of sharing I like to have. And that took a lot of vulnerability for me to share just a while ago. Why you would ask for permission, and that's a whole nother thing for my therapist. But but for me to share that story with you in the hopes that you get it, it's my attempt of trying to walk towards the bridge that people can see, hear my story, and empathize with me in a way that they'd have a light bulb go off or an internal shift. And so I think that I just hope more women, more rich white women, um, can really look at other women and understand that our experiences are very different, and that they have a clearer picture of what it means to look poor and what we're doing navigating in their spaces all the time, and that consciousness we're always experiencing all the time in their spaces. So
Well, it's interesting. What's interesting is that you described as their spaces.
well,
Why do the spaces belong to them?
girl, let's talk about it. I don't know, why did I say that? That is it's it does not feel like my space. It feels like a different planet. It feels, and it the anxiety I get when I have to go into these spaces, and the preparation I do on my way there, making sure that my hair looks a certain way, my nails are a certain way, the things that I would normally wear I don't wear. I'm very methodical about, do I feel like wearing a head wrap and having a million people ask me where does that head wrap come from or not. And so it doesn't feel like a place that I belong. um, I don't know how to make it my space. I don't know.
And I'm not sure. I mean, it's an interesting question. Like, how do you turn a space like that into your space or into a space that you feel really comfortable in? And it has everything to do with them doing the work.
Yeah.
Um,
Them doing the work, but also me doing my own work to get out of this place of deficiency I'm operating from, and coming in with a place of authority and confidence to want to to claim spaces. I mean, to hold my own space. I need to do that work too. And having the space allows for the authentic conversations to happen. I'm not in a headspace at all to be in that room now and be like, let's talk. Not you, but like whoever
right.
metaphorical person is. Yeah, let's talk and heal. I'm not there yet, and I think it has a lot to do with that place is not my space. I have too many other things of anxiety going on to even try to have a real honest conversation. And it makes me think about well, I'll talk to you about that later, but yeah.
What?
Well, I was gonna say, you remember how much I struggled with coming up with a authentic story to share to model the serial testimony, and I could not do it in that space. For some reason, I couldn't do it in on East Campus, and I think it has a lot to do with, oh, I don't belong here, so I can't be honest here. It wasn't until we got on my campus that I felt even remotely comfortable to actually share an actual true story. I think that has a lot to do with it.
That's it. I'm sure it does. And I am the opposite. I feel so much more comfortable um in spaces where I not don't belong, but aren't familiar to me.
Mm.
Because and forever I get nervous. I mean, I was nervous about this exchange because I know you and I admire you and I respect you. Whereas if I was doing a podcast with somebody I didn't really know, I wouldn't have been nervous.
Oh gosh, you were nervous about me? No,
I
but I
yeah,
get it.
I'm prone
Yeah.
to nerves.
Yeah,
But
because you were
yeah.
killing it on Vanessa Eccles' show. Like you were
Oh.
spit fire. I didn't even. I was like, I don't. This lady is a
Have you
genius.
listened to that? Have you
Yeah,
listened? Oh, I haven't because I don't, I get nervous.
you're amazing.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really kind of you to say thank you. I think you're amazing.
I know we're pushing about 45 minutes. I do want to get through some of these other questions. This
Yeah.
conversation steered off into a great place. I'm just glad that we got to capture what a semi tough conversation looks like.
Hmm.
Hopefully, this can inspire others to not be so nervous about, you know, being honest with a, 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 a woman that's different from your race. So I appreciate you.
I appreciate you too.
Let's see. We have a question here. What type of advice do you have? Oh, this is my question. What type of advice do you have for white women to do that kind of tough work we talked about in order to help support Black women or be an advocate or an ally?
So this was the most difficult question,
Yeah.
largely because I don't know that I am in any position to offer advice. I just what I've learned um from working with you and Rachel in this work for the hashtag Votes for All, and working with the Alliance for Truth and Justice and the Truth and Justice Project is number one, to listen.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Number two, and I think this is the case for all women, to just have the instinct to believe
Mm.
other women when they talk. Just believe them. If
Yes.
they're talking about their experience, if they're talking about their worldview, just believe them. Um, and number three, something that I've learned is to not take everything so personally.
Mm,
So when I'm sitting around, and it's always, we're always talking about race in these groups where I'm around women of color, that when someone says, this is what white women do, or this is what white people do, and they make a generalization about white people or white women, I've I have the instinct to say, wait, it's,
yeah,
more complicated than that, or, we're not all one person walking around. Um, but I think that that statement is just not necessary. If they really believed that, I wouldn't be invited to sit at a table with them to
right,
talk about
right,
racial justice.
right.
And so my advice would be to listen and to just, not have to, and this is really my advice to myself, not have to, it's not about me. It's
Yeah,
not about what, where I see the complexity and how I don't want to be stereotyped. I mean, sort of give me a break. And white women need to talk less and not be so sensitive. um,
no, I
that would be
think
my
that
advice.
I think that's great advice, and it's just so natural for us to talk in general terms, and so that to immediately personalize it, it's like you said, it's just not, it might not be necessary in that moment,
Right,
because it's so, and it happens all the time, and why sometimes I don't even speak up because I know if I say what I'm going to say, I might get met with a, well, in my family, or or I get met with, well, I also experienced that in this way that is, and then they start talking about something that's not even what I was talking about. And it's like, just listen. Not everything needs to be explained or rationalized, or, let me create a rationale for why what you said is a bit inaccurate.
right.
Um, and that, I mean, thank you for that advice because we really need it. And to your point earlier, you did say to, the importance of education, and that really where it starts to just learning the social constructs we exist in, the institutions we exist in, and how they've, created a framework in the way that we perceive the world.
Right. And how we participate in those. And we get used to, I don't know. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah. um, so how would you categorize yourself? Do you feel like you're an ally or an advocate or both, or where, how would, or even how would you define those terms for the work that you're doing?
So I did a little bit of research into those terms,
Yes.
the racial ally and racial advocate, because I've never identified as either. Just um, so as an ally, or I would like to see myself as an ally, and I looked up ways to be a good racial ally since we talked about this podcast. And the first um, one, or the first piece of advice was to listen, to like
Hmm.
not feel as though my voice is the one in the room that should be listened to. So to be more receptive, um, and to vote.
Yeah.
That was another. Um, and then also to acknowledge, to honestly acknowledge the way that I've benefited from these social systems where, you know, white skin has held more power in
Hmm.
this country, and how I've benefited from that. And um yes, I've worked hard in my life, but also I've been given just an enormous amount of privilege, largely through my race, but also my class to some extent. And those two things are, of course, married in so many ways.
Hmm.
Um, so to acknowledge privilege, to listen, and to vote with the community in mind and not just my family in mind. I
Hmm.
think those are good ways to be a racial ally. The second, in terms of racial advocate, the way I understand that is more sort of political activism. And I've done some of that. working with the community groups and um, trying to work locally to acknowledge the racial injustice that's taken place here with the massacre, with the lynching, but also, and I want to say this on this show, I think so often we talk about how Black men have been lynched, and that's really sort of the 20th century white crime. And it is to some extent.
Mm.
But to another extent, what we so rarely acknowledge is how sexual violence has
Yes.
worked between the white community to the Black community. So largely white on Black rape.
Mm-hmm.
And um, there's a historian, Danielle McGuire, who I read her book. It's called At the Dark End of the Street. That really talks about just how, we, I think about this crime as something that took place during the era of slavery, but of course it kept
Yeah.
going. And so we have this really visual crime of lynching, and I think there's a lot of community work being done with that. But the same amount of community work isn't being done to talk about sexual violence.
That's a great point. Yeah.
And so that, in terms of advocacy, I would like to see more of that here in Central Florida, because there's an enormous amount of sexual violence and violence against the trans community
Mm-hmm.
that is
Mm-hmm.
just under acknowledged.
Yeah, yeah. And when I talked about advocacy with Rudy Darden in my last episode, for him, I was sharing how important it is for Black men to know when to speak up on our behalf and when not, because we don't always need someone to talk for us, because we are looking for agency and spaces to even have a voice. Um, but something like acknowledging and referencing and bringing up that kind of a topic, I think is so important because, um, like you said, where it's just not acknowledged, no one is talking about it. And we don't talk about it. Well, I can't even speak. I just know from my own personal experience, the sexual violence or the sexualization of Black female bodies at a young age is just such a hush hush thing that it's even the way in which I internalize it. Like, you just don't talk about it, you don't acknowledge your own trauma. And so for you to want to pick that up based on your research and the history that you've studied in your work to talk about it, I just want to say thank you for that, because I mean, you made me think of some things in this conversation right now, and I think that's just really it's needed. And so if you see your work moving forward and helping talking about that, I just want to say thank you, because we do need people to talk about it.
We do.
Yeah.
We do. And it's something, and yeah, talk about the hush hush. It's just
Hmm.
been, and yeah.
Yeah. All right, so we can wrap up. I do want to just ask, because I did like this question, and we'll just end on this one.
Okay.
My intern Lion, he sent you some questions. I think, yeah, and this is one of his. He said, "What are the books that shaped your philosophies?" Do you want to share with our listeners some of your books?
So I don't, yeah, I mean, I, at the dark end of the street, which I didn't send, but Danielle McGuire's book
Okay,
really, I just hadn't thought about the prevalence of white on Black rape. So that was excellent.
and it's what'd you say? The dark.
At the dark end of the street, and I'm almost
Okay,
positive that's the exact. Her name is
okay,
Danielle McGuire.
okay.
So that helped shape, I guess, if we're talking about advocacy. But I just, you know, to be honest with you, um, so much of my research and so much of my interest in racial justice has to do with the fact that my grandparents, and specifically my mother's father, my grandfather, who was um, you know, who was, from my understanding, racist.
Mm.
Um, he was not, you know, from my mother's account, he didn't stand out as racist in the 40s or 50s, but from my perspective, he was.
Mm.
And he was, to me and to my family, such an intelligent, thoughtful, um, interesting, funny man. And so I started researching white masculinity, and its intersections with white supremacy, really to understand his generation,
Mm.
um, and to kind of complicate it. And one book that really informed the way I thought about it is a history by Jason Sokol, Sokol. That's called "There Goes My Everything," and it talks about, um, sort of how white men and how white communities sort of understood their place. And then, um, and of course, they were terrible racists, but they were also just people who weren't paying attention and who benefited from this. So I sent that. That's one of the books that I sent to, your intern, because as I thought about it, he's the one who really made me. Jason Sokol is the one who really made me think that I had something with my research at looking at white masculinity and white supremacy and how those things completely, um, overlapped in the middle of the 20th century. But then I don't read that many histories, even though I'm a historian. I like when I left grad when I left grad school, I was just like, I'm,
Yes.
fiction, right?
Yes.
So I do, I mean, the regular fiction that I think a lot of us enjoy. But I love Hemingway. I loved, Camus. I like people talking about food and drink and other
Yeah.
experiences. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Sun Also Rises,
I
Hemingway.
loved that.
Love that. Yeah.
I loved that book.
Yeah,
But
me
I
too.
haven't, I mean, have you reread any of his? I haven't gone back to them.
I haven't read anything since like 2011, and it's been a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's Arundhati Roy, The God of Small Things, which talks about, a brother and sister in India. That's one of my very favorite books.
Oh,
Yeah, there's,
okay.
that's worth.
Nice. Love
Yeah.
it. Well, thank you for this rich conversation. I actually, I'm gonna do some journaling after this because you've made me think about some stuff. So,
Thanks.
yeah.
Thank you. This was really, I mean, this was nice.
I
So
appreciate it.
rare.
Yeah. So, I guess we'll talk later.
Okay,
I'll let you
sounds
know
good.
when they're gonna put the episode out. It usually takes them about like a week or so.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, sounds good.
Stay safe.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
All right. Bye. Hi, podcast fam. Thanks for watching this latest episode of Black Women Be Well. Make sure you like and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more podcast episodes and for exclusive video content. Also, if you really thought this conversation was beneficial, please share it. I know our show is called Black Women Be Well, but it's not just for Black women, it's just our stories and perspective. So if you know anyone that's interested in being an advocate or ally for Black women who want to learn and want to grow, tell them about this episode and tell them about the show. And like always, be well.